Hello and welcome to
Wednesday's Night
with your host Joseph, Turnpike Plaza 365 Rec Squad.
We will be reading quotes that will change your life, a curated collection of mind blowing wisdom, edited by Russ Kick. Reality, truth, and such things. Since the initial publication of the chart of the electromagnetic spectrum, humans have learned that what they can touch, see, smell, and hear is less than 1/1,000,000th of reality. R. Buckminster Fuller.
The Dive from Clausen's Pier by Ann Packer. Chapter 6. Mike had woken up, and now I cried freely. I cried when I hung up the phone. I cried when I felt Jamie's arms around me. And I cried as everyone came into the kitchen and hugged me. Rooster, tightest of all. After Mike dove, the circles on the reservoir had widened exactly in time with my growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The relief I felt now was explosive, like the sudden surfacing of someone from underwater. Sprays shooting everywhere. Rooster drove me to the hospital, and I kept crying, leaning against the window and looking out at the quiet day. "It's okay," Mrs. Mayer said when we'd arrived at the intensive care lounge and I'd flung myself into her arms. So glad he'd woken. So glad I was glad. "It's okay." Dr. Spellman came in a little later. He was the neurosurgeon, and his cool detachment had us all cowed, even Mr. Mayer. He stood in the lounge doorway, his name in black script above the breast pocket of his white coat, and he talked about caution, about how much we still didn't know. "We need to watch him very closely," he said. I sat beside Mrs. Mayer, listening as intently as I could, when all I really wanted was to leave them where they were and run to Mike's room. I wanted his eyes on mine, just the sight of his open eyes again. But the Mayers had been in with him for nearly an hour, and now we had to wait. "That's number one," Dr. Spellman said. "Number two is this, and I know it'll sound obvious, but you'd be surprised how hard a thing it is to keep it right, keep insight. You've been waiting and worrying for 4 weeks, and now that he appears to be resuming consciousness, you're understandably thrilled. The last thing he knew, he was having fun with his friends. You can't expect him to be happy or relieved or grateful to find himself alive. He's waking up to bad news, Mr. Mayor said, even though his waking up is good news. Well put, the doctor said. Mr. Mayor nodded eagerly. Thank you so much, Doctor. We can't tell you how grateful we are. Dr. Spellman smiled. Don't thank me, he said. I didn't have a thing to do with it. When he was gone, Mrs. Mayer took my hand and held it, the fingers of her free hand busy stroking my knuckles. I had this feeling last night after we left, she said. I think even yesterday he was starting to come out of it. Did you notice? I thought he seemed a little lighter. I shook my head as another sob made its way up through my chest. I felt sick from all the crying, but calmer too, convinced I'd been under something heavy. Myself, a spell of numbness, even apathy. Now everything was different. It was over. He was going to make it. I put my face in my hands and wept. When we were allowed back in, the mayors told me I could go alone if I wanted, or with Rooster, but I wanted Mrs. Mayer with me. Mike lay on his back, no change apparent from my previous visit. The ventilator whooshed and sighed, whooshed and sighed. His arms and legs were heavy and pale, and his eyes were closed. He's sleeping, Mrs. Mayer whispered. Really sleeping. It's normal. I nodded. We're going to turn the den into a bedroom for him, she said, because of the stairs. I felt new tears stream down my face, and without looking at me, she took my hand. There's the TV already in there, and we'll hook up his stereo too. Maybe we'll have to build a new bathroom. His dad thinks we should wait and see, but we have to be ready before Michael is. That's true, I said. Mike, she said. Michael? At first I thought I was imagining it, but his eyelids fluttered a little and then opened. He looked straight at me, his gray eyes surprisingly clear. Could he see me? See anything? His eyes closed again, and he slept. For the next several days, I went to the hospital whenever I could, before work, after work, sometimes almost guiltlessly during work, explaining to Miss Grafton that I'd be right back, and then vanishing for an hour. Sometimes he never opened his eyes while I was there, but on others he seemed quite alert, seemed to recognize me, and I began to talk to him, just, Mike, it's me, and I love you, and everything's going to be okay. The doctors tested him. They searched for sensation and motion, for reflexes, but below the chest, it was as if he were dead. At least the injury happened at the lower part of the cervical spine, one doctor said. At least he'll be able to breathe on his own. And it was true. Although I felt there was some faulty logic in being glad about any of it, the word quadriplegic encompassed situations that were far worse than Mike's. Think of it this way, said another doctor. With an injury at the C5-6 level, he's technically a quadriplegic, but he'll function like a paraplegic without hands. I understand what he meant, that Mike would be able to use his shoulders and upper arms, that with mechanical devices strapped to his forearms, he'd be able to manipulate things. But I couldn't banish the gruesome image. Mike with his hands chopped off, blood pouring from the stumps. You hurt yourself, we told him. Remember the reservoir? You dove and hit your head. It was terrible to see the anguish of his face. Terrible not to know how much he understood. The breathing tube prevented him from speaking, so even once he was more alert, he couldn't ask questions. One doctor told him she'd pinched the tube closed for a moment so he could speak around it. But when the time came, the noise he made was unintelligible. A whispered note of misery, a cry for help without words. Finally, the mayors decided he had to hear it all, a full description of the accident and what it had done to him. We agreed that I would wait in the lounge, then go in afterward. Visiting hours hadn't officially started yet, and I had the place to myself. Out in the corridor, nurses in white passed by, orderlies in blue. Finally, Dr. Spellman strolled past, heading for Mike's room, and I understood that at that moment Mike knew the mayors had asked the doctor to let them tell Mike what he'd lost. But they wanted him to explain how Mike might be able to get a little of it back. Surgery to fuse his cervical spine, and then months and months of hospital rehab. The idea of Mike lying there knowing, my eyes filled, and I stood up and began pacing, fighting hard not to cry again. I once read an article that said women could be divided into two groups: those who feared they'd wind up bag lady, ranting on street corners, and those who feared they'd end up in mental hospitals, crying uncontrollably. Now I knew which group I belonged to. A little later, Dr. Spellman appeared at the entrance to the lounge. He came in and looked at me uncertainly, then suggested we sit down. I've just been with Mike, he said. He's very strong, your boyfriend. We're going to move ahead on the cervical fusion. He paused, and I wondered why he'd come in to talk to me. We'd never spoken privately before, and I was surprised he even knew who I was. I'm glad I saw you in here, he continued. It's premature to think too far ahead, but here you are, so I'll break my own rule. You're the person Mike seems most concerned about, most aware of. The nurses have noticed that he's a lot more alert after your visits than after his parents. Says, and just now he seemed to want to know where you were. We're engaged, I said. Except that everything's changed now, although that can be hard to keep in sight sometimes. I'd counsel you to go very gently these next few months. Rehab is very hard work. A lot of getting better is wanting to. He stood up and cleared his throat, and I felt my face burning. My fingers were actually shaking. As he walked away, I imagined my own outraged voice calling after him. You don't know a thing about me, I said. Not one single thing. I stood up and headed for Mike's room. Just outside. I paused for a moment and looked in. Mrs. Mayer stood at the foot of Mike's bed, looking flushed but composed. But Mr. Mayer was weeping, sitting in the one chair, his glasses askew in his lap, his big hands cupped over his eyes. I stepped in and they all looked at me. Immediately, Mike began blinking fiercely, and I squeezed past Mr. Mayer and stood over him. I'm sorry, he mouthed. His gray eyes were hard on me, moving over my face, looking and looking for where I was now. Where, given what had happened to him? Where, given the months beforehand? Forget all of that, I longed to say, but not in front of his parents, and how to retract something I'd never spoken in the first place. Remorse boiled through me, but I couldn't dwell on it now. I stepped forward and touched his forearm, then moved my fingers around to where he had some sensation. I stroked his skin. Don't worry, I said. I love you. Don't worry. A grateful relief filled his pale face, coloring his cheeks and outlining his dry lips. The day of the surgery arrived. From movies and TV, I had an image of efficient bustle. All those people in masks and gowns that fell apart when I heard Mr. Mayer talking about whether they'd go in from the front of Mike's neck or the back. Knives cutting him open, his blood spilling. It was unbearable. Don't touch him, I wanted to shriek. I know the anesthetic was a risk in itself, but at least it would calm his terror. We had one last vigil, this time near the OR. The Mayers, Rooster, and I. Finally, after almost 3 hours, Dr. Spellman came in and said, "It's over. Everything went smoothly. He's in recovery." And we bowed our heads and wept, each one of us. Only one person was allowed in, and his mother insisted So it was the next morning before I could see him. He was back in intensive care for one last day of observation, and as I made my way down the familiar corridor, I realized this could be my last time here. The ring of cubicles, the nurses' central work area, the hushed busyness and gravity surrounding the treatment of serious illness. It was a world I never expected to know, let alone so intimately. I reached Mike's cubicle and stepped in. He lay flat on his back, his head encircled by a steel band that had been attached to his skull with screws. Taut struts joined the band to a bulky sheepskin vest he wore. "Oh my God," I heard myself say. Mr. and Mrs. Mayer were nowhere to be seen, but Julie and John Jr. were there, and they turned at the sound of my voice exactly as Mike's eyes found me. "That's the halo," Julia said flatly. The halo, the device to keep his neck from moving post-surgery. Somehow I'd expected something less medieval looking, something more like a halo. "Hi," I said, and as I moved closer to him, I felt something falter in me, some kind of courage or resolve. He looked somber, his face full of shadows. "How?" I said. My mouth was like cotton. "How do you feel?" He licked his lips. "My head hurts," he said hoarsely. I nodded, and it was a moment before I realized he'd spoken. The tube in his throat was gone. The ventilator was off. Its hiss extinguished. "You're talking," I said. "You're off the ventilator." He didn't answer, and Julie said, They're weaning him off it a little at a time." "You're an angel, Mike," John Jr. said. "Get it? The halo?" Mike remained impassive, and I saw Julie give John a little kick. "My throat hurts," Mike said after a moment. "I'm thirsty." I looked at Julie. "Can he drink?" She shrugged. "I'll go see if you can have something to drink," I said. "I'll be right back, okay?" He was watching me carefully, his eyes wide and glassy. "Don't." "I'll go," Julie said quickly, and once she was gone, he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they'd gone dull. In a few minutes, Julie came back, followed by a nurse I'd never really talked to. She had an angry look on her face. "What are you doing?" she demanded, and for a second I wasn't sure whom she was addressing. She was looking straight at Mike. "Oh, of you, well, one of you has to go now." The three of us glanced at each other. Since Mike's awakening, the two people at a time rule had been relaxed, along with the 10-minute per hour rule. Joanne had told us they'd rather Mike had someone with him, even if it meant showing us out for procedures. He hasn't even been out of surgery 24 hours, the nurse said. Let's give him a rest. She went and stood over Mike. 10 more minutes, then you're back on the vent. She turned back to us. I'll be back in a minute, and one of you better be gone. She stalked out of the room, her white shoes squeaking on the floor. Bitch, Julie said. I turned to Mike and smiled. I'll come back later, okay? In a few hours. Don't go. Julie picked up her purse. We'll go. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and looked meaningfully at John. Mom and Dad'll be back soon, Mike, okay? John followed after her, but then lingered at the door. Can you have ice cream? I could bring you some later if you felt like it. I looked at Mike. Would you like that? I said, my voice false and bright. Butter pecan. But he didn't respond. He just watched until John had disappeared. I looked at the screws going into his head, then quickly looked away. It was important to talk to him, but what could I say? He didn't care about ice cream or how hot it was outside or any stupid thing I could think of. Anything's going to be okay. It wasn't. Everything's going to be okay. It wasn't. He made a noise in his throat as if he were trying to clear it, but couldn't very well. Could you kiss me? He said. I was stunned. I wish you could kiss me. He went on. Carrie. And it was only then when he said my name that the real, long, missing sound of his voice finally reached me. His distinctive, low voice, which had been silent so long. Tears streamed from my eyes. How was it that I hadn't thought about his voice at all, hadn't missed it? He was waiting, and I wiped the tears away with the sides of my forefingers, then dried my hands on my pants. I lowered my face, but then stopped, unsure how to avoid the halo. What would happen if I touched it? Would it hurt him? Slowly, carefully, I pressed my mouth to his cheek, then pulled away. He had pursed his lips and was holding them together. He stared into my eyes until I bent again and pressed my lips to his. I was about to straighten up when I felt his tongue against my mouth, soft and warm and infinitely familiar. The Dive from Clausen's Pier by Ann Packer. Turnpike Plaza, 365, Rec Squad.